Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. We are continuing with our work on the subjects of what is most pressing in our world today, looking at it very seriously, very soberly, as best we can from as many points of view as we can, and then coming up with remedies, with solutions in, let's call it a wellness model instead of just the old pathology model, even though there's a lot of pathology kicking around. And with our guest today, Chris Hedges, we're going to be looking at a lot of that pathology, but fear not. We will come up with some solutions if we all band together collectively, which is the only way out and, let's say, as Jung would put it, through our psychic dilemmas here. So as means of introducing you to our guest today, I just want to let you know that Chris Hedges is a best-selling author and Pulitzer-prize winner who has been working for nearly 20 years as a foreign war correspondent in Central America, Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. He was a Times correspondent for some 15 years, and he's lived in both Cairo and Jerusalem. He's reported from over 50 countries and has spoken to countless number of innocent civilians, as well as high-profile politicians and policymakers. He's personally witnessed the horrors of war throughout the Middle East and, as I recall, the Balkans. So, Chris, it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you on today.
Thanks.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have seen all sides of human nature in your work. What's interesting is not only do you have a background very thoroughly in the political landscape of our world, but also based on your own upbringing in a ministerial style family, the moral, psycho-emotional landscape as well. When you take the larger view of what's going on this planet, based on all your many, many years, what is it that you come back with and have to report?
Well, at its core, it's an inability to honor the sacred, that everything is turned into a commodity. Human beings are turned into commodities. The natural world is turned into a commodity that is exploited for profit until exhaustion or collapse. And that is the fundamental problem.
Yes.
With the rise of a corporate state, there are no longer any impediments or regulatory mechanisms by which the citizenry can protect themselves from abuse. And riding into New York today on the train on the front page of the New York Times is a perfect example of that. In the state of New Jersey, Governor Chris Christie has just slashed basic benefits for public sector employees, and that is a campaign that we are watching throughout the country. The last readout of union activity is being destroyed, dismantled by a corporate state that is barreling the nation towards a kind of neo-feudalism, an oligarchic system where you have Wall Street bankers making $900,000 an hour and two-thirds of the country reduced to increasingly subsistence level.
Exactly.
So, and that, of course, is twinned with the environmental crisis, and it's not accidental that the very forces that are waging war against working men and women and increasingly the middle class are poisoning the very sustenance of life within the ecosystem.
Water, soil.
I mean, the bottom
hydrofracking.
The bottom line is that if we do not wean ourselves away from our addiction to fossil fuels very, very soon, then life for huge parts of the planet will become untenable. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, temperatures would still rise. There's about an estimated degree Celsius captured within the oceans, but eventually that will be transferred to the atmosphere. 1, 2, 3 degrees increase in global temperatures is catastrophic. It's already melting the Arctic. And yet we live in a state of utter self-delusion.
We live in a bubble.
Well, we either pretend it's not happening, which is, of course, what the Christian right is doing, ignoring the science, ignoring the empirical evidence. We just had the House of Representatives pass a resolution that denied that global warming was a significant
Did you say revolution?
That's
interesting.
Did I say revolution?
Yeah. What are you thinking?
Well, I'm not thinking revolution. Revolution tends to be replacing one power system with another, but I certainly am thinking methods of revolt.
You make that point very well in your book, by the way.
But the other problem is that even for the people who accept the language of scientific rationalism and the empirical evidence, they are equally self-deluded in that somehow we can adapt, somehow we can produce something called clean coal. Which is, of course, an advertising gimmick.
Well, it's an oxymoron, really.
Well, it doesn't exist.
That's my point. I want to just interject a little bit on the note of the geopolitical arrangement regarding fossil fuel, that not to bring forward a solution just yet. I want to save that for a little bit later down the road. But there is a company with which I'm affiliated and helped to build, which is offering a solution, an electric motor Tesla-style solution to the use of fossil fuel that can be applied everywhere. In fact, there is a motor used today guzzling gasoline. So on the one hand, there is this decline into a state of abject greed that doesn't seem to know a bottom, sort of the way Dante was pointing out many years ago in his Inferno. And there is this new creative spunk, a spirit that is coming up with technological, largely, solutions to a lot of our current situation. On the level, Chris, of current events, I don't know if you saw two interesting articles that, one, they highlight the debacle we are currently facing that I know you have a lot to say about. One is a banker named Paul Allen in Virginia who was, believe it or not, arrested for the embezzlement and fraud of $3 billion he was found to have hijacked, and he is getting sentenced to 40 months in jail. Now, that will probably be a country club-style prison, and he'll probably get out early on good behavior. Right next to that article was one about a black man in Louisiana who went into a bank. Guy was hungry, family hungry, and he said, this is a stick-up. They handed him a bunch of hundreds, of which he took one. He left the bank scot-free, came back the next day feeling remorse, apologized, and gave back the $100. Sentence, 15 years.
Well, anybody who spent time in our internal colonies, as I have been doing in places like Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the country, or
among them, yeah,
you recognize that there's two systems of justice. I mean, the only person for all of the fraudulent activity, and it is clearly fraudulent, when you have companies like Goldman Sachs providing subprime mortgages to people that they know can't pay it back, then selling it to pension funds and 401ks as an investment, and then betting against it. I mean, this is just criminal behavior.
Truly.
When you have this kind of activity going on, and yet the only person on Wall Street who goes to jail is Bernie Madoff because he steals from the rich.
Yes.
Yes. Underclass in this country, which increasingly includes the middle class, is unrepresented and utterly disempowered within Washington. And you see this after every piece of legislation that is being hammered out. Are
you aware of the move to reinstitute the Glass-Steagall Act?
Yeah, but I mean, there has been no effort on the part of the Democratic Party to regulate the speculative financial system that caused the first meltdown and seems set to cause another one.
Very true.
The Democratic Party has just codified the destruction of both domestic and international law that was put in place by the Bush administration.
Well, when Obama came out at the very beginning, even Holder wanted to go after Bush and Cheney for war crimes and any other their surveillance issue, etc. And Obama said, this is not one of the most foolish comments to make. Let's not look at the past. Let's look at the future, as though these two were not completely intertwined.
Well, and as if those who have suffered egregious acts of injustice somehow shouldn't be recognized within a functioning judiciary. That is the very foundation of the rule of law.
Exactly. So-called democratic system.
So,
what do you make of that comment that he made at the beginning of his presidency?
Well, Obama understands where the centers of power lie and what he has to do in order to retain his position. He knows who he has to pay allegiance to, and that's why we are now watching on the eve of the presidential election Obama make even more fervent overtures to the financial class at the expense of the rest of the public. And I think this has always been true of Obama. I was or am good friends with Dennis Kucinich.
Just who I was thinking about when you...
And
yes.
Was supporting Dennis during the Democratic primaries, and then supported my close friend Ralph Nader afterwards. Indeed, wrote several of his major policy speeches. Because, as Dennis said, you've got to go back and look at the 2-year voting record of Obama in the Senate, because it's horrible. It's at one corporate giveaway after another. And that's how we should determine who we vote for, not the hype of sophisticated public relations and advertising. How we are very skillfully in this country, in a country utterly awash in lies. They know how to make us confuse how we are made to feel with knowledge. And that's precisely what happened under the Obama campaign, which is why when the campaign was over and he'd won, Advertising Age presented Obama with their top annual award, which is Marketer of the Year. The professionals knew very well what he had accomplished. And he beat Nike, he beat Apple, he beat Zappos. And that's how Obama functions as a brand, in the same way that you saw people of color and HIV-positive models on billboards a few years ago put up by Calvin Klein and Benetton to kind of give their products an edginess, even associate with risque or progressive politics.
World ethnicity.
Yeah, but it was, it did what all brands do, which is that it made a passive consumer confuse a brand with an experience. And that's precisely what the Obama election campaign did extremely well.
Yes, exactly. The essence of advertising. That's very interesting. I didn't know that he won that award. And that is precisely the way to describe his campaign and what he did. I was wholly behind Kucinich, who we've had on the show, and I was actually promoting a mixed ticket of Kucinich as president and Ron Paul as his running mate. I wanted to completely confuse Chris,
right,
the psychological state of red and blue, and create a coherent purple.
My problem with Ron Paul, and it's interesting, Nader is reaching out to Ron Paul.
Who I voted for Nader, after all, not Obama.
I mean, I think that Ron Paul has some very good critiques of empire, of the financial system. I think that he points out correctly the assault against the rule of law. I think all of this is good. But I almost look at the libertarian philosophy as a pre-modern philosophy. Because when you have corporations that have the power of ExxonMobil or Halliburton or Citibank or Raytheon or Northrop Grumman, unless there are robust mechanisms within the power centers to impede the their natural tendency towards exploitation and abuse, then we are left unprotected. And I think that is probably the biggest failing of the libertarians, that they haven't confronted these forces that have become more powerful than the central government itself. Indeed, the central government, whether it's Clinton, whether it's Bush, whether it's Obama, works on their behalf. And if they don't work on, if these politicians and parties don't work on their behalf, then they're pushed aside. There is no way in this country, through our electoral politics, to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. It's impossible.
Well, they control the Treasury Department and the White House.
Yeah, I mean they write
and
they have been able to rob the American taxpayer of
exactly
at this point trillions of dollars.
I understand the point you're making about the libertarian perspective by all means, but I just to say that a fellow who is a U.S. historian and has been working with Lyndon LaRouche for many, many years, is someone who's been educating me a lot about the reinstatement under the sponsorship of Marcy Kaptur, Congresswoman, of the Glass-Steagall Act. So it's almost funny that the libertarian perspective has been modernized. It has been updated to recognize that regulations are required to pull us out of the current morass.
Right, but you need well-funded and expansive government agencies in order to regulate these, and they need a kind of autonomy. I mean, I've been working in the state of West Virginia, and the coal company owns, every local politician, every state politician, and at this point, the federal government. Jay Rockefeller, the senator, originally ran on a campaign where he opposed mountaintop removal and strip mining, and he got shellacked. And when he learned to dance to the tune that the coal companies played, he could become senator. And so we have laws, the Clean Water Act, which is violated egregiously with the poisoning of some 2,000 streams in southern West Virginia on a daily basis, and yet it's not enforced.
Isn't there an ethical, I should even say, I know there's an ethical issue, but isn't there a legal issue, Chris, with companies owning politicians? We use it as a glib phrase at this point.
Sure, it's called corruption.
Right, but isn't it funny how that has become part of our normal conversation as though it's okay? We see it in New York State, we see it everywhere. But isn't it odd that there is no judicial will to enforce the law?
Well, the judiciary has been like all of the three branches of government, and let's also include, what's often referred to as the fourth branch of government, which is the press and the media, has been completely corporatized. And we just saw the Supreme Court rendering this horrendous decision against the workers of Walmart the other day, allowing, through Citizens United, to for corporations to not only fund and create systems of propaganda within political campaigns under front companies where they don't have to even be exposed. I mean, it's a staggering piece of legislation. So I think that the last sort of redoubt of hope for those who care about a civil democracy, I think, was in the courts, and we've now seen finally the courts themselves fall under the thumb or under the power of the corporate state.
Very true. And in fact, one of the great stumbling blocks in that regard was in the year 2000, Bush v. Gore. And to watch that occur, where there was the appointment, not the election, of a president, and the media, as you so well dissect them in your book, The World as It Is, your latest book, really properly analyzes, and I'll go so far as to say virtually eviscerates the media as it currently stands, that they have no relationship to truth. They hide behind this notion of objectivity and reasonableness and fairness, and you really properly obliterate those false notions. And I want to just say a word of appreciation to you, if I may, which is your searing and unflagging interest in the truth at all costs, and your willingness to say, how could any journalist simply sit by and report about death and murder and war and be impartial about it? It's a complete lie. And this is something, I'm so glad that you discussed this, because it's always something, I never actually considered myself a journalist. I'm actually a holistic psychotherapist by training, who really through Gary Null got introduced to the media back in the early 90s and saw this as a platform for showing people themselves and for healing on a collective scale rather than on a one-on-one model. So you're saying what you did. I always feel deeply emotional about the interviews I do with people like this, because you're bringing forward so much juicy material that I can't sit passively and say, oh, how interesting. It's not interesting. It's outrageous, and that's what you keep reporting on, the outrageousness of what we have come to accept as the norm.
Right. Well, and there's been a...
So that's a compliment, by the way.
Well, thank you. There's been, of course, within most of the commercial media, a complete degradation of the news. So there isn't even anymore an attempt to do anything beyond salacious celebrity gossip and meltdowns. And, I mean, the latest was Anthony Weiner, and I think before that was Charlie Sheen. And, I mean, it
yes,
goes
exactly.
Stretching back.
Oh,
back
just
back.
Put sex in, and they're over.
And
yeah.
These kind of mini dramas or pseudo events are forms of entertainment masquerading as news.
That's
while the
right.
most important questions about the death of empire, the fact is that on a very fundamental level, we can no longer afford both the levels of consumption and the imperial wars that we are waging. We have run up the largest deficits in human history. We are playing very dangerous games with our currency. The monetizing of debt, well, that's just the printing of $600 billion worth of new money with nothing to back it up. The gamble is that because the dollar is the reserve currency, they can get away with it. I'm not an economist. Maybe they will. But I think almost all economists, even those who support this attempt to monetize the debt, which is really an attempt to create inflation, not only recognize it as a Hail Mary, but are in total agreement that if it fails, it will be catastrophic. And I have lived through 3 currency collapses, in Argentina, in Nicaragua, and then in the former Yugoslavia, where I covered the war for the New York Times.
What happens when that happens on the level of the people?
Well, what happens is that the moral order is instantly turned upside down. All of those people who put money away every month into savings accounts, or who lived on fixed incomes like pensions or municipal salaries, are instantly wiped out because their money isn't worth anything. While the gangsters and the profiteers and the speculators and the warlords rake in millions. So on a kind of moral level, socially responsible behavior is no longer rewarded on a monetary level. What also happens is that the traditional centers of power across the political spectrum are instantly discredited. Everyone in Sarajevo knew that Radovan Karadzic was insane. He was writing long, epic poems in Serbian about Sarajevo going up in flames. He was the psychiatrist for the Sarajevo soccer team, but I think he was even the assistant psychiatrist. And what happens is that in that kind of rage, people turn towards figures that are, in times of more stability, regarded as buffoonish. You can look back at the collapse of Weimar Germany.
Mm-hmm.
the ridiculousness of Hitler and the Nazis, certainly to the educated elite, the way that they were satirized in the cabarets in Berlin, the assurance by von Papen and the rest of the German aristocratic class that if they allowed Hitler to come in as chancellor with his broken Austrian dialect and poor table manners, he would be instantly controlled. Well, of course, within a year, the entire cabinet was controlled by the Nazis. And that's what happens when currencies go down. So,
in other words, fear grips the land even more powerfully.
Well, more than fear, rage.
Yeah.
Rage grips the land, and rage at because there is a kind of blind trust in traditional systems of power. That that veil is instantly ripped aside. And so, and then you see very frightening political distortions where demagogic figures start hunting within the internal society for scapegoats. In the former Yugoslavia, that resulted in a very bloody ethnic war. The Serbs would blame the Muslims or blame the Croats would blame the Serbs and the Muslims. It became a kind of feast of fools.
Very ethnically based.
You always find a weak, marginal group within a society who is blamed for the collapse. So in our case, and you've already seen it'll be Muslims, undocumented workers, and then and the Nazis, remember, were big on this, homosexuals. I mean, the first book burning in Berlin, the first decree that Hitler passed when he took power at the end of January 1933 was banning all clubs in Berlin where homosexuals met, and the first book burning was that May, where the Nazis stormed the Institute for Sexual Science run by Hirschfeld and burned the library. And, of course, the German churches and the bourgeois middle-class public cheered them on. And I look at how we have utterly stripped Muslims within this country of constitutional rights. The prosecution of Muslim activists, whether it's Dr. Sami al-Aryan or Fahad Hashmi, I mean, there's a long list, and throwing them, in the case of Hashmi, into supermax prisons for really no other crime than expressing dissident political viewpoints. And some of these viewpoints I don't endorse. I mean, Hashmi lauded the Taliban, but he has a right to express it, and more importantly, he has a right to protection from persecution and imprisonment for expressing it.
Well,
so when you have a democratic administration, as we do have now, that hasn't even restored habeas corpus, then in a time of turmoil, there are no protections left. We already are seeing within civil courts, and this was done with Hashmi, done with Al-Aryan, secret evidence, which means that those who are accused are not allowed to see the evidence presented against them. They are put in Guantanamo-like conditions where they have complete isolation for 23 hours a day. They're naked, they plied with antidepressants, and we all look the other way because they're Muslims. But this is exactly, you go back and read Defying Hitler by Sebastian Hoffner. He was a lawyer in Germany, not Jewish. His girlfriend was Jewish. And he writes that because he was in the law courts when the Nazis took power, he writes that the first thing they did, the most important task, and I think that's true for any despotic regime, is that they corrupt the legal system. They strip away the capacity of the average citizen to appeal to the legal system to defend themselves. And we've already reached that point. I mean, we've reached a point where the President of the United States can authorize the assassination of an American citizen. I'm speaking about the Yemeni cleric. And all of these become precedents, so that when the society breaks down, and I think unless there is a radical reversal at this point, that's probably inevitable, then you have allowed the state to amass for itself very frightening mechanisms of control. And going back to the libertarians, this is something that Ron Paul and the libertarians have been quite good, I think, on addressing and speaking about.
We are speaking with Chris Hedges, an award-winning journalist and the author most recently of The World as It Is. This is Mitchell J. Rabin on A Better World on Progressive Radio Network, and we will continue on with our discussion about this book and the world also at large. Chris, some people ask this question: who is in charge of who's in charge?
Well, at this point, it's clear who's in charge, and that are these mega corporations that at this point have seized control internally.
Specifically, who are you referring to?
Goldman Sachs, Citibank, ExxonMobil, many of the corporations we mentioned before, Halliburton, General Electric, Viacom, Monsanto, Bank of America. Remember, the top 25% of these Fortune 500 companies didn't even pay any taxes. That's staggering.
Yes.
I paid more in taxes than Bank of America has paid for the last 3 years. They didn't pay any taxes.
And you've been unemployed for a few years since you left the New York Times.
Well,
I'm kidding.
I've been unemployed, but I didn't have a steady
just to add
paycheck.
Insult to injury, Yeah.
So, they're the people who are in charge, which is why you see the Koch brothers work so hard within the Tea Party system to deflect attention away from Wall Street, where in the initial stages of the Tea Party it was directed towards government. Government, they're the puppets.
What about such bodies as the Council on Foreign Relations and what is referred to broadly as the Bilderberger Group? Let's just say old money, the Bank of England, more, let's say, European established bankers.
Well, I think in terms of the Council of Foreign Relations, you have to look at them as they are the administrative class for the power brokers. So that when Dick Holbrooke, who just recently died, isn't in power, then he went to UBS and like all of them made a few $1 million. Then he's hanging out of the Council of Foreign Relations. In fact, he was running for president of the Council of Foreign Relations. And so then a Democratic administration comes in and they're all integrated back into the system, and the Republicans get to hang out in the Council of Foreign Relations. I mean, that's sort of a simplistic view, but
yes,
it recycles this kind of permanent bureaucratic class. And that's the function of institutions like the Council of Foreign Relations, and unfortunately now it's the function of most political science centers like the Wilson School or the Kennedy School. Mm-hmm. It's where you go to sort of cool your heels until you come back into power. And it's not a bad deal if you want to sell your soul.
Yeah, right.
I went to graduate school at Harvard. I did not go to the Kennedy School. But I certainly am very familiar with the Kennedy School, and it is just a house of prostitution. I mean, they will bring in dictators from around the world, and it doesn't really matter. The only litmus test is power. Either you had it or you might have it. And in terms of actually any kind of morality, it is irrelevant.
Second. It's always subordinated.
The Wilson School at Princeton is the same.
I have long said that our democracy, so-called, I think very loosely and lightly called, really doesn't go together well with capitalism at all. Totalitarianism goes much better with our capitalist economic system. And as a result, this government has actually befriended every single major and even minor dictator across the world, from installing the Shah from what was a democratically elected president in Iran to Pinochet, to Marcos, to Suharto, absolutely across the world, and then more recently Mubarak et al. And there is no affinity between the United States of America and other democratic nations. They always prefer a dictator.
Well, that's what you learn if you're a foreign correspondent. You learn the dark side of empire and how...
So have you found that to be so then?
Yeah, the last thing that the American government wants in the Middle East is democracy, because they'd end up with Islamic governments, as they did in 1991 in Algeria, and then it was primarily a French initiative. Although we were involved, it was overthrown.
Yes.
So...
well, you don't exercise the same kind of control for corporate takeovers.
You had...
Oil control, essentially.
You had free and fair elections in Gaza. Hamas won. We called for those elections. They were monitored by outside international observers. They were probably, one of the fairest elections anywhere in the Muslim world.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't like the result. And so we first attempted to carry out an internal coup d'etat, which failed, and then we split the government between Fatah and Hamas. So, and remember, I worked in Central America. I was in El Salvador in the early 80s. I was there for 5 years, Nicaragua, Guatemala. No, democracy is the liberty, freedom, civic virtues, these liberating women in Afghanistan. These become all the advertising gimmicks to cover the raw and brutal
quest for power,
expanse of war and of imperial power.
Exactly.
And of course, imperial power serves corporate interests.
Exactly.
My family has been here since 1633. We were one of the founding families of East Hampton, New York.
Mm.
But I watch within my own family that the occupation of Cuba became, once the island was taken, it was divided up between wealthy capitalists who had, once the western frontier could no longer be exploited, we turned to the Philippines, we turned to Cuba, and in my own family, they became the largest landowners in Cuba.
Really?
The largest landowners, the largest textile mill. They made millions and millions and millions of dollars off of
early iterations of the Hedges family.
If you look at any history, Cuban history, look in the index, you'll see Hedges. And then, of course, as everything began to unravel, they all went and worked for the CIA. So just within my own family, it's a kind of window into how those who are connected, and that, of course, is traditionally a white, upper-class, northern, industrial-based business community, will use the systems of propaganda to carry out naked exploitation, which, of course, is what they and others did in Cuba.
It's interesting.
And that's just, I just pull Cuba out as an example, but it's...
Well, you have a personal, if you're a family relationship with that. It's interesting now that the choices that you're making in your life is to very much champion the little man, if you will, and you're going to various communities across this country that are the poorest of the poor to speak their voice and help them be heard in the midst of all of this confusion. It's an interesting counterpoint to the heritage of yours.
My father was a renegade who walked out on that. He was a Presbyterian minister and was a very vocal supporter of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, although he'd been a sergeant in North Africa in World War II, and then finally the gay rights movement. So
I remember your
was
stories.
Schooled very well. The whole family wasn't perfidious, but I actually had a good role model of a father who didn't devote his life to trying to get rich.
Yes, right. It's very interesting. Now, on the other side of the ledger, there are the David Cortons of the world and the proponents of the new economics. And we've spoken about this a little bit between us, as well as I've had these gentlemen on the radio show over time. There is a wonderful movement afoot to empower local economies and to step out of the larger nationalized and transnationalized corporate scene, whether it's for food or whether it's for water or whether it's for any materials, but to go back home to one's own backyard, village, town, community, and start building from the ground up. What do you think about that in terms of making actual headway in the face of these monolithic structures known as the corporatocracy?
I think it's important. I think food is increasingly going to become a political issue. We saw in the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt how important,
of all things, a bag of fruit, right?
Commodity prices, in particular wheat, which over the last 8 months has increased by 100%. When you live as half of the Egyptian population does on about $2 a day, and half of your money is already going towards food, and you see those kind of commodity price increases, then you really begin to experience hunger. And we, because of our affluence, have not confronted that crisis, but it's coming. You have roughly 40 million Americans who live in a state of poverty, and they're now spending about 35% of their income on food. We have allowed agribusinesses to distort food distribution systems, not to mention the fact that through pesticides they poison the soil and the water.
Yes.
So that half of just about everything fresh that you buy in a supermarket in New Jersey, where I live, is shipped across country from California. Now, once gasoline prices start reaching $5 a gallon, what's happened in poorer communities like Camden, which is that these, especially fresh fruits and vegetables, become prohibitively expensive. They just aren't sold. There is no supermarket in downtown Camden. People eat processed food. They eat Church's Fried Chicken. They eat donuts. That's also true where I was working in West Virginia.
So they go to the fast food joints, where food is also expensive, by the way.
It's expensive and it's garbage.
Of course
so that
is.
they're the same as in West Virginia. You go to McDowell County in towns like Jenkins Jones or Gary or these people have to drive over an hour to get to a supermarket, and even then it's sort of Wonder Bread heaven. But of course, when you're poor and going to the gas pump means putting in $4 of gas, even if you have a car, you can't afford to drive. I've been working in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which is usually the poor. I think it's the second poorest this year, but usually the poorest county in the country. People who are surviving on about $200 a month in food stamps. They use food stamps like currency. That's where we're headed.
Mm-hmm.
And so local food production becomes essential. But that is not finally going to blunt the crisis. Cornell University did a study a few years ago where they asked if the state of New York had to feed itself locally. So everything that is consumed was actually grown or raised in the state. Mm-hmm. What percentage of the population could be fed? And they estimated 34%. So urban centers like New York become very problematic as food prices rise. And these food deserts that you see in places like East New York or the South Bronx or anywhere will just spread outwards. I saw in the war in Yugoslavia that the families who lived in places like Belgrade who were best able to survive still had family relations in the countryside where they could actually still get eggs and still get food in a kind of barter arrangement. So I think food is key, and I think self-sustainability is key. Unfortunately, using high-efficiency light bulbs and hanging your laundry out to dry and trying not to drive and use your bike, and all of which I do, isn't going to stop the assault. the entire economy is driven by the dependence on fossil fuel. Half of all our electricity comes from coal-fired plants. And we've done nothing to mitigate that.
Formally.
So it's important, but in and of itself, it isn't going to solve the crisis. And this, of course, is the great failing of Al Gore, where he utterly ignored the primary contributor to global warming, that is our corporations. I found it somewhat ironic that Gore was tongue-lashing Obama the other day. Remember that in 8 years in the White House, he never mentioned global warming, ever. He never mentioned it in his campaign. You talked about Bush being appointed by the Supreme Court by fiat, which is, of course, correct. And many people, and courtesy of the Democrats, bought into this cliche that Nader gave us Bush. I almost don't know how to respond. I mean, the Republican Party stopped the counting after 2 counties in Florida because they knew, as Gore now says, that Gore had won. They rammed the thing into the Supreme Court, where they overturned all legal precedent, and Sandra Day O'Connor was the deciding vote on this because she liked Bush's daddy and thought Bush Jr. was like his dad. And handed us a president. And the Democratic Party...
Well, she was also very close to Jeb, the governor of Florida.
Well, she was close to the whole Bush family.
Of course.
And although she later didn't like George Jr.
After he was appointed.
Right, and she found out what a venal piece of garbage he was. So, you know, the systems of propaganda are very effective and very powerful, so that even within the class of people who have a kind of consciousness, they will swallow these very empty cliches, which are really cliches manufactured by the power elite to make sure that we remain disempowered.
Yeah. Look, I understand everything you're saying. I appreciate it. And at the same time, I have a sense that if everyone did as you do in respect to conserving energy personally and your family, and as do I rode my bike across 14th Street to get here and do that every day, and take certain measures to reduce the reliance, reduce our carbon footprint, etc. And it's not just that. It's not just a left-brain, linear, quantitative matter. It's ultimately, and I think we agree on this, a spiritual matter of people coming together on the level of community and building community and withdrawing. Now, this is what I don't know for sure, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. From an economic/quantitative point of view, if we all vote with our dollars and we stop giving the money to farms that are fed with Roundup, for instance, and we stop banking at Bank of America and Citibank, etc., and we just started to build local credit unions and the like, and really brought the energy and the power home, and we multiplied this out state by state, like in Pine Ridge, like in McDowell County, et cetera, under, let's just say, your tutelage, and others, and really formed a nexus on a local level. Do you think that that could have some kind of significant impact over time on the current debacle in which we're living?
Not overall. I think that it may allow monastic-type groups to be self-sustaining. But let's take upstate New York, where I grew up, and where you have local food movements. Nobody has been able to, within these movements, halt fracking.
Not yet.
Not
but
yet.
I did interview Senator Tony Avella, who has a ban fracking bill, not a moratorium, but a ban fracking bill, and we are helping him build momentum toward it.
Well, it hasn't worked nationally. I mean, take for instance, universal, not-for-profit health care for all Americans, a bill introduced by Kucinich and Conyers. When Obamacare rolled around, even Conyers and Kucinich voted against their own proposal and supported this horrific bill, which ends up being the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, $400 billion in credit.
I think Kucinich got hoodwinked somehow.
Well, I know the story. I know. They put very heavy pressure on Dennis. I mean, very heavy. Yeah. But that's the point. These people play hardball. So let's take upstate New York. You can, if you build a sustainable community in rural area outside of Albany or something, you still are living in the same way that the residents of southern West Virginia are living, with powerful corporate forces. In the case of southern West Virginia, it's coal companies that have literally turned poison. They've turned the whole hundreds of thousands of acres of the Appalachian Mountains into wastelands. The water is poison, the air is poison, cancer is endemic. I've been in towns where everybody in the town has had their gallbladder removed, and there is no power to stop them. So you have a similar kind of situation now underway with fracking. And these people are so powerful and have so much money and are so well connected, and the capacity to punish and steamroll anybody who stands in their way. And I think that on a micro level, it may make it possible for readouts to hold out, especially as temperatures soar and the disasters of global warming begin to kick in. The freak weather patterns, 800 tornadoes, I think, since April in the United States, and yet, of course, nobody connects anything.
Yeah, right. Don't dare connect the dots.
Massive flooding by the Mississippi, and wildfires in Arizona. And this same kind of weather patterns are being replicated in China and in Australia, and we just we don't look.
Turn a blind eye.
So I think that all of it is great and all of it's important, but at the same time we can't be naive about the perfidiousness of these systems of power and how they will make sure in the end they get what they want at our expense.
So what do you see as the dismantling process, or what do you see then, Chris, as the solution to our current very devastating dilemma?
Civil disobedience. And I've been down with Veterans of Peace and arrested outside the White House, and I'm going to go down on October 6th where we're going to camp out and not move till I guess they move us. I think that's it. And, Bill McKibben and Wendell Berry and a lot of other people I respect are saying that this is all we have. And I think that it doesn't help us to have a kind of Pollyannish view. It's bitter and hard to accept how bleak it is at first. But it's from that point that we can begin to carry out acts of resistance that are grounded in reality. If we somehow think that we're going to have a brave new world tomorrow or in a year, or huge movements are going to arise that are going to save us, then we set ourselves up for despair and cynicism. And I think we have to look at this the way the great moral and religious resistance figures, people like King, even Malcolm X, looked at it, that there is a moral imperative to resist, to fight for life. That's what we're called to do, that all battles against, or almost all battles against injustice will have to be waged after we are gone. We're all mortal. We all die. And that we are called to fight for life and to trust. And that's what faith is, that the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it, is what we are called to do, and that good goes somewhere. The Buddhists call it karma. We don't know where. But faith is a belief that it's not futile. And in that level, I have faith. And, of course, nonviolence. The temptation as things to break down towards violence will become greater and greater and intense. But I can tell you, having spent 20 years covering war, that the poison of violence, the contamination of violence, even when it's employed in a just cause, corrupts all who touch it. And you end up replicating the pathology of the oppressor. That is just true in conflict after conflict after conflict. So I think that one of the failings of the left in this country is that it lost that understanding that the religious left had, that the Berrigans had, that King had, that Malcolm had. And we have to regain that understanding because, as Camus writes, the essence of an independent life is really about rebellion.
Chris Hedges, I so appreciate your perspective and your learnedness and what you're bringing to the table, including especially your commitment to speak the truth and, as best you can, right the wrongs through your means.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you on today. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World on Progressive Radio Network. I'm so glad you came and joined us again. Tonight, just please note, there is a benefit concert, songs and dance from the Caucasus Mountains on the Upper East Side. For information, it's designed to help orphans in Soviet Georgia, or I don't know if it's Soviet anymore, but Georgia. And if you're interested in finding out more information, please contact us at 212-420-0800. As well, visit our website, www.abetterworld.net, and become part of A Better World community. Thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.